everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Allie. And today, because it is the last day of February and I have decided to cut myself off from reading for the rest of the month. I actually cut myself off a couple of days ago, but here we are. I am going to be doing my February wrap-up. So the reason that I decided to cut myself off from reading any more books this month is because I already read 10 books. If you've seen my January wrap-up, and if you haven't, go ahead and go watch it. I also read 10 books in the month of January, and because of that I remember how difficult it was to get through every single book that I read in January and talk about it all in one wrap-up video, and having to edit it is just kind of like a whole ordeal, mentally, physically. It's a lot. But yeah, without further ado, I should just get right on into the books that I've read. So because of the fact that it was Black History Month in the month of February in the US, I decided to put a lot of focus on reading some of the books by Black authors that I've had on my TBR. So the first book that I ended up picking up was Homebodies by Tembe Denton Hurst. And this is like a literary fiction novel. And this book actually kind of reminded me a little bit of a book that I read, I believe a year or so ago, called Subtweet. Basically, this book is about this young woman, and her name is Mickey, and she works as a journalist, and everything seems to be going really well until she ends up losing her job, and she believes that she has lost her job due to racism within the company. And so she ends up penning this sort of manifesto calling out this racism, and things sort of start to spiral from there. And I feel like the reason that it kind of reminds me of the subtweet is because she does tweet it out. So basically the fire starter for this entire novel is a tweet, and so that's kind of why it reminds me of it. And also the subtweet does deal with stuff like racism, and it is a literary fiction book. So I mean, if you liked the subtweet, you might really enjoy Homebodies. However, for me personally, I just felt like Homebodies was a little bit disjointed in its storytelling, and I felt like the characterization of Mickey, she just felt like she was very hell-bent on completely destroying her life and making so many incredibly illogical choices. And I'm fine with like characters who make choices that I wouldn't personally make, or who are really messy or complicated or whatever, but there has to still be some sort of logic behind their choices, even if it's not like my kind of logic. If they can make logical sense of their choices based on who they are as a character, then that's fine. But this character just seemed to make choices for no good reason and out of thin air, and it started to make me really question this character. And the fact that there was really no development over the course of this novel for this character just felt really weird and wrong. So unfortunately, this book ended up not being one of my favorites this month, but we move on. The second book that I read in February was You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke Emezi, and I also had some issues with this book as well. I actually first tried to read this book, I believe a few months ago or maybe a year ago, and it just wasn't really meshing with me at the time. I wasn't sure if I could like give it my full attention. I think I might have been feeling a bit of a slump coming on, so I was like, you know what? If I'm not immediately feeling into this book, I should just pass on it and like leave it for another time. And so I decided to pick it up this month. And this book I had a lot of also very complicated feelings about. I feel like this entire month I just had like complicated feelings after complicated feelings. Like constantly I was like reading these books that I just was not really loving to my full capacity of like how I can love a book. So that was a little disappointing, even though I've read so many books this month. But basically, You Made a Fool of Death of Your Beauty is like this sort of romance novel that leans a little bit more literary fiction. And it's about this young woman. She has, I don't know if it's like super recently, but she is a widow. Her husband died in a car accident that I believe she was also a part of. And so she has been dealing with the grief of losing her husband, and she ends up meeting this guy, and they kind of form this relationship. and they become really close, and he invites her to go back to his family home. And once they are there, she ends up starting to fall in love with his dad. So already it wasn't like one of my favorite kind of tropes. I'm not super into like the boyfriend's dad or just like the dad trope in general. It's not typically what I am looking for in a book, but I had heard so many good things about this one and I was really intrigued by the premise. So I was like, you know what, let's just try it. And this time around I was able to actually feel a little bit more engaged in the plot and in the story. However, I did have a few issues with it, especially concerning characterization. I felt like both the main character and the character of the dad were very much like one-dimensional, cardboard cutout, no real personality. A lot of the personality came from kind of like their relationship with each other, like that tension, and also the grief that these characters were both experiencing. And like that doesn't really make a personality. Like they need to have some specific traits that I can like assign to them, but I can't like say like, oh, this main character was really funny or really snarky or like any other sort of personality trait that you can come up with. She just kind of felt like very one-dimensional. And so especially in the romance genre and even equally so in the literary fiction genre, I feel like these two genres really rely heavily on extremely well developed and constructed characters. So when you don't have those in the romance or even the literary fiction genre, what else do you have really? And especially in romance, where the entirety of the genre relies on relationships between characters. How are you going to be invested in a relationship between two cardboard cutouts? It doesn't work. And then in my review on Goodreads, I actually said, this book is for the you don't owe your family / friends anything crowd. It's like those posts on Twitter where it's like, you don't owe your family anything, you don't owe anybody anything, you just be yourself, you just do you, and you do whatever you want. It doesn't matter if anybody else is affected by your actions, you're just in control of yourself, etc, etc. So ultimately, while this book was entertaining in the way that those Am I the Asshole Reddit posts are entertaining, it just didn't really work for me. It's kind of a bummer way to start the month, honestly. At that point, I think I was a little bit worried that I was gonna get into a slump because I'm like, there's no way any book is going to save me, at least this month, from how badly it was starting off. But then I ended up deciding to read Come and Get It by Kylie Reid, which I was very highly anticipating. And I had an ALC from Libro FM because I'm part of their program, so I get the advanced listeners copies of a lot of books every single month. And I think maybe a month or so ago, I got Come and Get It. I believe it might have been for December. And if you know me, you know how much I loved Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. I recommend that book so often, and I really enjoyed it back. I think I read it in like 2019. So it's been a while since I've read a Kylie Reid book, and this one was very different in style. You could definitely see a huge jump in Kylie Reid's writing ability. Like, Such a Fun Age was written really well, but this one seemed to be a bit more mature. And this one's a little bit harder to explain because there's not necessarily like a real plot to this book. It's very character driven. So if you are not like a genuinely character driven reader, this might not be the kind of book for you. And this one takes place during 2017 at a college, and really seems to center around this group of girls that live in this dorm, and also a writer who kind of comes in and interviews some of the girls in this dorm. I feel like that's as much as I can tell you, like plot wise. There's really not a plot holding this book together, but it works so well in my opinion. I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars, so it kind of made me feel a little bit better about my reading month in February. And this book had a lot of really interesting conversations and observations about like race, gender, the like social makeup of college and what that's like compared to like the real world, or like the world that these, you know, very young adults have left behind. You really get to see how all these characters from different backgrounds and experiences all kind of come together and interact with each other. And I really enjoyed that. I thought the writing style was really good. I thought the characters were so realistic and so well-rounded. And yeah, overall I just had a really good time reading this book. It definitely isn't going to be like one of my new favorites, but I think that I would definitely recommend it if you are really interested in character-driven literary fiction. I feel like if you enjoyed Catherine House but want something with a little bit less like magical realism sort of elements in it, then Come and Get It is a really good alternative or recommendation for that kind of reader. And then the fourth book that I read in February was Feybound by Sara El Arifi. This book has been getting a lot of hype recently. And by recently, I mean literally within the past like week or so. Before I read it, I hadn't really seen anybody talk about it or pick it up and read it or whatever. So I think that this book came out really recently. It's kind of getting touted around as like romantasy, but it really is not romantasy at all. It definitely leans more adult fantasy with like little hints of romance. There are definitely romances kind of like at the forefront. They don't really take a very dominant role within the narrative, so I don't really feel like it could be classified as romantasy. These romances were really underdeveloped in my opinion, and that's what kind of held this book back from being as good as it could have been. And it also kind of made me realize, or sort of recognize I guess, because I've been reading a lot of adult fantasy for the past few years, and the things that I've noticed, especially very recently, is that a lot of adult fantasy published within the last maybe year or so really overcompensates on the world building, in my opinion. And I feel like it is a product of a lot of these conversations that we have in different writers' spheres on the internet, is focus a lot on world building. Like, make sure that every little tiny detail and aspect of your world is built and developed and whatever. And I don't disagree with that necessarily. I think that especially as a writer, while you are drafting, it's really important to have thoroughly thought out your world, and I don't want to dissuade people from doing that, and I do believe that it's really important, but I don't believe it's super important to tell your reader every little detail that you've come up with for your world. I don't think it's super necessary. And more often than not, especially when it's all like grouped together in the very beginning of the book, it's overwhelming, it feels like info dumping, and it's super unnecessary. It feels very much like telling over showing. I would much rather glean glimpses of this world throughout the narrative in ways that aren't necessarily like the author sitting us down and being like, here's your little history lesson for the day, and it lasts like way too long. But I've seen it happen so much lately, and I think it's because authors are afraid of being called out for like a flimsy world, which I understand. I fully get that sort of insecurity and that fear, but I would rather have a flimsier world with a more interesting plot and more well-rounded characters than a super lush and complex world building technique being employed and have flimsy characters, a flimsy plot, boring. You know what I mean? So for authors, I think that yes, it is important to build up your world and create it and make sure that you have like a lot of the very fundamental things figured out, but I don't think that it's more important than character or plot, even in fantasy. And that's kind of the downfall of this book, is that it worried way too much about the world building. Way too much. These characters were so cardboard cutout, one-dimensional. Nothing was going on up there. The plot was pretty flimsy. There was multiple times when I was reading this book rolling my eyes and being like, oh, here we go. You know, I'm like, duh, of course he's whatever, you know. I don't want to do any spoilers, but you know what I mean? Like, you'll read these sort of like fantasy books, just like the most obvious things happen and you're just like, duh. duh. And maybe this would impress somebody who hasn't read very much fantasy before. Like maybe this is their first toe dip into adult fantasy or just fantasy in general. This book might be really impressive, but for me it was just kind of very overly convoluted, but also very run-of-the-mill. The next book that I read in February was Flower Heart by Catherine Bakewell. And this is a like cottagecore, cozy fantasy, very low stakes, very light. And I did actually really enjoy it. I felt like it was a very nice reprieve from Feybound, which was very intense and convoluted. This one felt like a nice little sea breeze coming off and, you know, refreshing me from such a toiling journey. It was really, really cute, I will say. I'm still not quite sure the rating I wanted to give this book, because at first I was like, okay, 4 stars. And then I kind of thought about it a little more and I'm like, does it really deserve 4 stars? Like, does it live up to other 4-star rated fantasies that I've read? Not really sure, but I did have a really good time reading it, so there we go. Basically, this book is about Clara, and she is, I don't know if they call them witches in this universe, but she has magic, and she has to kind of go through this test in order to be sort of like licensed to use her magic, but she makes a lot of mistakes. Like, things go wrong. She doesn't have a very firm grasp on her magic, and so they deny her of this test, of like this license, whatever. And so in order to kind of get her skills up to par, she employs the help of one of her childhood friends who she hasn't really talked to in a while, and they kind of left on bad terms. He's very well regarded, and so he kind of agrees to help her with her magic. But when she accidentally harms her father and she needs his help in order to save her father, he kind of makes this deal with her that he will help her get this sort of like license or whatever. However, she will have to give up her magic to him in order to save her father. And I did have a really fun time reading it, but I just like, it's not one of my new favorites, so I'm still not really sure how to rate it. And then we started to get into some of the books that I enjoyed a lot more this month. And so I ended up reading Until the Stars Fall by Vanessa Rassinen. And this one was such like on a whim. I was just going through Hoopla. I wasn't sure what to pick up next. And I decided I'm still in a fantasy mood, so let me pick up like a real romantasy. And I ended up loving this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I had such a good time, and it's part of the series that are like these interconnected stories, but they follow different characters, so that's really exciting. And I cannot wait for the second book. I'm gonna be totally like there first day. But basically this book follows a human girl, and she lives within this kingdom that is really not very nice to the humans, but all of the Fae are in charge, like Fae Kingdom. And she has worked for the royal family for quite a while, and she was also really good friends with one of the Fae princes, the younger one. There's 2 of them, the older one and the younger one, and she's always been really good friends with him, but they were kind of like discouraged from hanging out anymore because obviously like she's a human and he's a Fae prince, so they cannot really be friends. One day her safety is kind of like put into peril, and she kind of gets sent away to train with this group of humans who her mother once knew, and she ends up coming back to the palace kind of like a changed person and more powerful than she had been in the past. But when she gets back, she almost immediately gets into trouble and is nearly sentenced to death. But the older Fae Prince brother ends up coming to her rescue and is like, actually, she is going to be my bride-to-be, you cannot kill her. And so they have to kind of get into this sort of like fake engagement sort of thing. And it was just such a fun book. I just had such a good time reading it. I thought it was really well written. I loved the characters. I was so invested. I thought that they were all really interesting, and I loved the romance. And I honestly cannot wait to see where this world goes in the second book, because I really have no idea what's going to happen next. So it'll be really, really intriguing. But I do highly highly recommend this book. It doesn't seem to be super popular. On Goodreads, it only has 733 ratings and 338 reviews. So it's very, very underrated. I would love to see more people pick this book up and give their thoughts and opinions on it. I really enjoyed it personally. I thought it was a lot of fun. So if you're interested in looking into romantasy, I would definitely recommend this one. And the next book, I believe, is my only 5-star read this entire month. So that's definitely saying something. And I ended up finally picking up Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. I guess not finally. This book came out in October of last year, so it's not super old or anything. But I have had this arc on my shelf since before October. I kind of kept getting a little bit discouraged with it because I didn't love one of Alex E. Harrow's other books. So I was like, ooh, I don't know, am I gonna like any of her other ones? Should I even pick any of them up? And I finally decided to pick up Starling House because I'm like, you know what? I've read so many books this month anyway. If I don't end up liking this one, it's no big deal. But I am so glad that I ended up picking this book up because I loved it so much. I cried heavily at the end of this book. I just loved it. If we are talking about incredible characterization, this book at the forefront. I loved the characters in this book. The main character, especially the female main character, impeccable, incredible. She was so snarky and so fiery and feisty, and she fought for what she wanted. She fought for her brother. She was so like responsible and caring, but also guarded, and I just loved her so much. And I loved the male main character. He was like very like mysterious and very like stoic, and she would kind of like poke at him and prod at him and like mess around with him and try to get under his skin, and it was perfect. I loved this book so much. On the back it says, Eden, Kentucky is just another dying bad luck town known for only the legend of E. Starling, the reclusive 19th century author and illustrator who wrote The Underland and disappeared. And The Underland is kind of like sort of an Alice in Wonderland-ish type of book, but it's a little bit more dark and sinister and a little bit more spooky. Before she vanished, Starling House appeared, but everyone agrees that it's best to let the uncanny house and its last lonely heir, Arthur Starling, go to rot. Opal knows better than to mess with haunted houses or brooding men, but an unexpected job offer might be a chance to get her brother out of Eden. Too quickly, though, Starling House starts to feel dangerously like something she's never had, a home. As sinister forces converge on Starling House, Opal and Arthur are going to have to make a dire choice, to dig up the buried secrets of the past and confront their own fears, or let Eden be taken over by literal nightmares. If Opal wants a home, she'll have to fight for it. This was such a beautiful book. I absolutely adored it. I highly, highly recommend it. It is adult contemporary fantasy, just as a heads up. I loved this book. I love the romance in it. I love the fantasy elements in it. I loved the small town. And then towards the end, just immediately broke me. It deals a lot with like family dynamics, abuse, everything like that. I feel like you might need to check trigger warnings if you're going to be interested in this book, so definitely make sure to do that. But highly recommend it, especially if you're into like gothic contemporary fantasy. It's perfect. The next book is one that I hesitate to talk about because I ended up DNFing it, and it was actually a really, really late DNF. I think I only had maybe 60 or 70 pages left of this book. It was like very near towards the end, and I was truly so devastated because I was really enjoying this book up until this moment. And I feel like I feel a little stupid, and I feel like I should have just known, but like I never saw anybody talk about this aspect of this book. But unfortunately, it is The Light We Lost by Jill Santopolo, and I was really, really enjoying this book. However, as I was reading it, I started to realize pretty quickly towards the end of the book, which was like, I wish that I would have gotten all my emotions back and everything, but whatever. Unfortunately, this author is a Zionist. I'm personally choosing not to support authors that are like very obviously Zionist, and if I had been following this author on Instagram I would have known this, but unfortunately I didn't, and I wasn't, so I ended up having to DNF this book. But because I'd put so much emotional work into reading this book, because I was really loving it and it was really like getting under my skin and just like it was so beautiful, I decided to count it anyway because I feel like I deserve that. Unfortunately, I can't recommend this book. I cannot recommend this author. I ended up unhauling both of the books I had from this author, and we're just gonna wash my hands clean of it. The second to last book that I read in February was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, and I absolutely loved this book. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I want to talk about why, but I still feel like I have very complicated feelings about this book that I have not quite untangled just yet. This book basically follows this white author who has had a very unsubstantial career, and her debut novel didn't really get the sort of like recognition and popularity that she had hoped for. And this white author really seems to blame a lot of it on the fact that she is white, and she believes that the current literary publishing industry is a little bit biased, or very, in her terms, very much biased towards publishing authors of color. And so she is really good friends with an Asian author, and they are out for drinks one night and they go back to this author's house, and the Asian author ends up choking and dying. The main character, who is the white author, she ends up stealing this now dead author's manuscript and publishing it as her own. And this book was so unhinged and so insane, but also so entertaining, and I had such a good time reading it and just being like, what the fuck is going on? It kind of reminded me a lot of like the sort of literary fiction that's like My Year of Rest and Relaxation, those kind of books, and even a little bit of the Subtweet. I read it in literally one day. I think one of the only things that like I didn't truly love about this book was the ending. I felt like it was a little too obvious and I really called it from like a mile away, and it just sort of felt a little disjointed from the beginning of the novel. It felt like the ending of a different kind of novel, which I think was kind of intentional in a way, but it just didn't work for me narratively. Oh, you're so cool. Continue to rev that engine. You're really, really fucking cool. I don't get it. But also I will say that this was my first R.F. Kuang book. I actually have started both of her other books, The Poppy War and Babel, but I have not finished either of them, which don't come for me. I promise I will finish them. I just haven't yet. I think that if I love the books as much as I loved Yellowface, then it'll be fine. It'll be great. And then the last book that I read was another one that I feel pretty complicated about, and that is Post-Traumatic by Chantal V. Johnson. This book is another literary fiction novel. I felt like I read so much literary fiction this month, but I've been wanting to read this book for quite a while, so I was really excited to pick it up. And I just ultimately felt like, objectively, it was a really well-written novel, and I understand why the author did what she did, and I can see objectively the ways that it worked, but subjectively, I just didn't like it. It just wasn't one of my favorites. It just didn't really mesh well with me, and I think that that's where the complicatedness is kind of coming in, is that like I'm of two minds of like, this objectively was a pretty good book, but just subjectively it didn't work for me. And I also wonder if maybe if I had read this book before My Year of Rest and Relaxation, if I would have liked it more. But I just kept like kind of comparing the two books and being like, seeing where My Year of Rest and Relaxation did very similar things but better, in my opinion, whereas this one just didn't feel like it fully hit the mark. But I did really like the fact that this followed a Black Latina character. I thought that that was really interesting, and there were a lot of things, especially in her family life and in her family dynamics, that I could really relate to. But I will say that this book deals a lot with childhood trauma, childhood sexual trauma, etc., things like that. So definitely keep that in mind before jumping into this book. But basically it's just about this woman named Vivian, and she outwardly seems to have this really great life. She's a successful lawyer who works very closely with psychiatric patients. However, just like within her own life and her own self, she's dealing with a lot of turmoil and the effects of being part of this very dysfunctional family and having dealt with a lot of trauma in her childhood. And throughout the narrative of the story, it starts to come to the forefront and starts affecting every part of her life. And I thought that that was really well done. I thought the exploration of childhood trauma was really interesting, and the ways in which it affects people, even if it's like kind of an echo years later, that the aftershocks of that trauma can be just as painful and destructive as the initial trauma was. And I also thought that a lot of the friendships were really interesting. Like those dynamics were very complicated and really nuanced. However, I just like, there was something about the storytelling that just did not work for me. I did actually talk to one of my friends who had DNF'd the book after I was finished with it, and we had a really good conversation, and it both made things clearer for me but also a lot more complicated, because I'm like, I really don't know how I feel about this book now. So maybe by the end of the year I will kind of know how I feel about this book, but right now I'm still like, I enjoyed it, but I also didn't. I don't know. I might have to read some more reviews and kind of like polish my thoughts on it. But for right now, I will say that I do recommend it. I think it's a really interesting book, but it's not going to be for everybody, right? And not every book can be for me either. So it's complicated. All right, so those were all 10 of the books that I read in the month of February. I definitely had a lot of ups and downs, a lot more downs than I had ups, I will say, but I think that it was all worth it because I did end up reading Starling House and loving it, and also Yellowface, and also a few other of the books that I read this month that I did enjoy, like Come and Get It, and also Until the Stars Fall. So I mean, I did have some really great standouts this month, but I also had a lot of books that I just personally did not enjoy. So yeah, that is my entire February wrap up. In the comments down below, let me know the books that you read in February, and also let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, especially the ones that I felt like were a little complicated, like post-traumatic and stuff like that. Like, let me know what you thought if you read those books. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!